Welcome everyone to this afternoon's session of partnering session as part of the EU Green Week 2021. This is a webinar co-organized by the Zero Emission Platform and the Global CCS Institute. And before we begin today's presentation and discussion, I advise you to please submit any questions you may have using the Zoom Q&A function. And please note that this webinar will also be recorded. Let me start with introducing myself. My name is Lamberto Eldering. I am one of the vice chairs of the Zero Emission Platform. And in my normal daily life, I work for Equinor. The Zero Emission Platform, let's give you a short background on the ZAP, the Zero Emission Platform is a technical advisor to the European Commission on carbon capture and storage and carbon capture and utilization. It is a European technology and innovation platform under the European Commission Strategic Energy and Technology Plan, also known as the SET plan. We are very lucky with a broad membership, not only in numbers, but also in various elements of the energy sector. We have industrial companies, we have utilities, oil and gas producers, trade unions, environmental NGOs, all being member. And what you see on this slide is only a snapshot of our membership. We coordinate with other initiatives on national, European and international level. And this webinar in collaboration with the Global CCS Institute is an example of that. We consider ourselves to be the go-to organization to liaison with European institutes, and we have close collaboration with the EU member state and governments. Next slide, please. First, I would like to give a brief overview of CCS and CCU and the difference between those. When we talk about CCS, carbon capture and storage, we talk about CO2 emissions that is produced from an industrial or an energy process to transport it safely and to store this into geological formation. When we talk about carbon capture and utilization, then we are talking to a wide range of applications where, again, the CO2 is captured, but then it is used for industrial purposes, like converting it into fuels or creating it into a product like cement. The climate effects of these wide scope of utilities has to be carefully monitored. And SAP stands for those actions and supports those actions that contribute to the carbon abatement, the net carbon abatement of CO2. Next slide, please. For Europe, it is very important to have a CO2 infrastructure in order to meet its climate goals for the 2030s and the 2050s, and beyond that, but let's keep it to 2050s. And to do this in a cost-effective way. That means that it is important that we will have the storage sites that is connected to emission sites. And unfortunately, these storage sites are not evenly distributed over Europe. And that means that the European Union and its members needs to collaborate in order to develop an infrastructure that allows the industrial sites that are coping with CO2 emissions to have access to geological storage in certain legislations that can manage these emissions. That means that CO2 will be transported by pipe, by ship, by trucks, by train, and Europe needs the framework for the investments in this kind of technology, in this kind of infrastructure. We are very lucky to have CO2 infrastructure recognized already under the 10E regulations and also known as the PCI list. And we are now currently on the 4th PCI list with 5 CO2 infrastructure projects of common interest. The current process of the 5th list is ongoing, and we're very happy to see that we now have increased the number to 8 projects that have applied for the PCI status on the 5th list. Please go forward. CCS is not something new to European Commission or to Europe in itself. Already in the early 20s, we had quite some focus on developing CCS. However, how we are looking at CCS and the value of CCS going forward has changed over the time. In the early 2000s, there was a high focus on decarbonizing or using CCS as a decarbonizing tool for power. And a number of projects were initiated to capture CO2 from coal-fired power plants. But as we have progressed and learned from that experience, unfortunately not with so many projects being passing the investment deadline, but the learnings are still valid for today. We have seen that CCS is much more broader and actually is currently a key factor in decarbonizing emissions from industry and the energy sector as a system. That means that we need a framework in order to meet those targets and to help industry to do the investment necessary to meet the 2030 and the 2050 targets. It was quite a paradigm shift, and we are very happy that to see today that we have renewed and growing interest in CCS. We see initiatives of industrial decarbonization coming up, and we are now also talking about carbon dioxide removal, which are becoming much more relevant, setting the Green Deal and the new strategic targets for decarbonization. The Paris Agreement of 2050 has been a key element in changing this, and the current discussions towards a net zero 2050 are on strengthening the recognition of the value and the necessity of CCS in meeting this target. I should also mention that the hydrogen strategies that are now being developed in Europe and in the individual member states are also indicating and showing the value of CCS of meeting these ambitions and targets. Next slide, please. Like I said in the previous slides, CCS is not something of the future, it's also something of the past. It is not rocket science. It has been done already since the 70s, although at that time being more an activity in the US. But since the 1990s, CCS has been done in Europe. What you see on this on these photographs are two pictures of the Sleipner natural gas field. This is a so-called sour gas field, which means that there is a high CO2 content in the gas, and that is being reduced by capturing CO2 and storing it safe into geological formations. This has been ongoing for 25 years. And with all the other initiatives of CO2 capture and storage, we now have about 260 million tons of CO2 emissions of human activity safely stored. Next slide, please. So to set the pace for what is needed for Europe in CCS going forward to the 2030s, we have increased climate ambitions, not only in Europe, but globally. And they will prove that we need more CCS in meeting those. The European Commission already stated that zero or very low carbon technologies, which include hydrogen and CCS, will be needed to develop and test it at scale in this decade. The Zero Emission Platform has done a modeling on the 1.5 degree scenario with the UCL Energy Institute. One of the conclusions from that study is that a median CO2 captured by CCS is about 230 by 430 million tons of CO2 per year by in the 2030s. And these are EU numbers, not globally, but EU numbers. If we now take a snapshot of what we see out there of projects being initiated and are in several stages of development, but would be considered market ready, we are currently calculating 15 million tons of CO2 per year captured by CCS. This shows an enormous gap that needs to overcome, and a correct framework for that would be necessary going forward. Next slide, please. And this concludes my presentation. And with that, having set the stage for today, I would like to introduce you to our next speaker, which is Vincent Bassillot from the European Commission.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, everybody. Do you hear me well?
Yes, I do. Yes, we do.
Okay, excellent. Thanks a lot, Lamberto. Indeed, your presentation was very comprehensive and informative. And I'm sorry, but maybe I will repeat a few things you have already perfectly well presented. So I'm Vincent Bassillot. I'm operating within Unit I1 in charge of energy-intensive industries within the Directorate General for Internal Market, Industry, Entrepreneurship, also known as GICO. I have a long record in the industry before joining the Commission 7 years ago, and I'm following specifically some key energy-intensive sectors such as cement, glass, ceramics, contributing also to steel and so on. And I've had a focus also on carbon capture, storage, and utilization as part of the different technologies which are absolutely necessary to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. Next slide, please. Okay, so here is this flow chart of the carbon capture, utilization, and storage ecosystem. I would say it was already presented by Lamberto. Just to mention that it's something which is a kind of supply chain and also a downstream chain between industry where CO2 should be captured, then transported, either stored or used according to CCS or CCU. Next slide, please. Okay, so when we are dealing with CCS, carbon capture storage, what is the potential for the EU? Why is it so important for the EU? And actually, is there a lot of opportunities where we can develop this technology as a part of decarbonization action? Well, this is why this map is represented. These two maps are presented. One is where the emissions are in terms of tons of CO2, and on the right side, storage capacity data, which have been collected, and we see that there are quite some opportunities, not too far from the main emitting regions of the EU. But at the end, as already said, the theoretical storage potential is not uniformly distributed. So when we are dealing with the development of carbon capture and storage, we are facing a certain number of challenges. Next slide, please. And the one key one is the economic challenge, and we consider that it's a current one, and it should be addressed in a way that we would be able to cope with it. For the time being, there is a lack of a viable business case. It is still cheaper to let CO2 in the atmosphere than to capture it, use it, or store it. And here is some calculations which have been made with regard to the cost of CO2 avoided in US dollars per ton. And we see that according to the different industries where this CO2 can be captured or used, the cost is below, let's say, 25 US dollar up to 188, close to 200 US dollars. Next slide, please. Another aspect of this, for the development of this the technology, is the different barriers we have to overcome in order to achieve the development of CCS as planned by the different policy tools, and as mentioned by Lamberto with regard to the strategic energy transition plan, the technology plan, which I will come back later on. So we have already a very big barrier, which is the public acceptance. Storing deep in the underground large quantity of CO2 is not something easy to make accepted by population, and there are already some critical cases across Europe. Of course, it's an activity. It's an activity which requires a lot of procedures in terms of permit acquisitions, and this means long lead times, about 10 years to appraise and permit the CO2 storage site. On top of that, there are some business risk as something new. It requires to develop the necessary interdependencies, which means building the ecosystem all along the value chain in order to have ready on time the CO2 capture infrastructure, the transport infrastructure, the utilization or storage, and carbon credit should go to the capture, and so far carbon credit goes to the capture and the installation, while liability for leakage is with the CO2 storage operator. So this is where the kind of discrepancy between the carbon credit and the liability and risk for the CO2 storage operator, and it's part of the business risk already identified. On top of that, certain technological pathways are not yet incentivized, such as CCU chemicals and building materials, which can be produced from carbon capture when utilized, and also direct air carbon capture and storage, and biomass and carbon capture storage, which requires further development, further acceptance, and also in the case of productions of new kind of products issued from the carbon capture utilization, this requires market acceptance for these new products, and this is the kind of barrier not easy to overcome. But eventually, financial institutions, as you can imagine, financial institutions are not very keen on taking the risk, and as they see this activities as new, they are relatively reluctant in terms of risky investment. Next slide, please. So, as already mentioned, we have to achieve. We are facing a strong political agenda at the EU level. Let me mention again the climate neutrality, also known as the EU climate law, which claims for climate neutrality in the long-term perspective, which means by 2050, and more recently, the increased ambition by 2030 for the development of zero low carbon technologies development of business concept, and also all of them should be tested at scale in this decade, actually within 9 years ahead of us. Which means that we have to scale up CCS and CCU to meet EU climate huge ambitions. And this goes through the objective of CCS to reduce emissions of remaining fossil fuel use, specifically in the power sector, where some coal or gas are still used, or some heavy energy intensive industries, such as cement, chemicals, or also refineries and so on. Which means that CCS and also CCU are necessary for us to decarbonize such industrial processes. Let's mention, for example, the case of cement, where there are two basic sources of CO2. The one is when heating the raw materials, and the other one is when is achieving the chemical transformation of the calcium carbonate, which release 60% of CO2 emitted by the cement industry. CCS could be combined with biomass, the CCS, with direct air capture, and it's required for net carbon removals to achieve climate neutrality. Also, captured carbon could be stored in materials, for example, with through production of new kind of plastics issued from carbon captured and utilized. And also production of new CCU fuels. All of them should be among the different applications of CCU and CCS to be scaled up in order to achieve these climate ambitions at the EU level. Next slide, please. In terms of policies, specifically CCS is addressed by a wide array of EU policies. Of course, there is this absolutely dedicated directive, which is the CCS directive, which the main aim is to ensure CCS is done safely for the environment and for human people, for human health. Also, the EU energy trading system allowances system, which states that allowances do not need to be surrendered when CO2 is geologically stored, in the case of CCU, but not for the CCU, unless for the production of PCC. And the updated EU ETS will be there to strengthen the carbon signal and to support the development of CCS. I should mention also the very important dedicated funds from Europe, such as Horizon Europe, Innovation Fund, funded by ETS, Connecting Europe facilities, specifically dedicated to transport facilities, and in the case of CO2 for transport of CO2, with, I would say, two key objectives. The first one is to achieve cost reduction of CO2 capture, and also reducing the energy penalty, which is overburdened with this technology. And the second objective, which is to ensure safe CO2 storage through measuring, monitoring, and verification, in order to secure public acceptance for this kind of activities and infrastructures. Let me mention also the sustainable taxonomy, which is in development, where CCS is in, and CCU not, but CCU may be in the future. Next slide, please. So let me consider now, even if it has been already covered by Lamberto, ongoing CCS projects in Europe, they are quite numerous. So 30 CCS projects in preparation to deliver about 50 million tons per year of CO2 stored by the 2030. But reaching climate neutrality in Europe requires 6 times more CO2 to be stored per year by 2050. So we are still far from the objective. Next slide, please. Let me mention also the first call for the Innovation Fund. The Innovation Fund, one of the world's largest funding programs for climate action. We see that carbon capture and storage, 14 applications have been put in this first Innovation Fund call, which is about, and there were some criteria such as CO2 store avoided on sufficient scale. Slightly more than half of the invited CCUS projects include carbon utilization, and slightly less than half include carbon storage. This is the result of the applications. We can say that projects involving CCUS had a slightly higher success rate than the average. No storage, only projects were invited to the second stage. So is the next slide, please. So in the technology pathways, carbon capture technologies are well represented, and we are preparing the second call for large scale projects. The launch will be in October 2021, with submission deadlines in February 2022, and we expect results in July 2022. Next slide. As already mentioned by Lamberto, the strategic energy transition plan has 2030 targets. I won't get into the different figures which have already been said by Lamberto. What I would mention is that the member states have completed national and regional CCS roadmaps for the development of a dedicated CO2 transport infrastructures, and including clusters of CO2 sources and shared cross-border CO2 infrastructures, which is part of a 10-year network development plan. Additional IPCI for CO2 have been mentioned, with a special focus on Central, Eastern, and Southern Europe, where there are opportunities for both capturing and also storing. And I mentioned that CCS are now part of EU member state strategy through national CCS roadmaps for transition towards net zero by 2050, as developed in national energy and climate plans, which you can get all the detail about this information at this web link. Next slide, please. And some words for in conclusion. What we can say is that CCUS are key technologies for Europe to become a climate neutral continent by 2050, which is something now well agreed. It should play a crucial role in the EU Green Deal for transition of energy-intensive industries and power sector. This is something which was already mentioned in the master plan for decarbonization of energy-intensive industries, as published in 2019. CCS can help decarbonize industry with very low carbon hydrogen produced from natural gas, and the research and innovation part of Horizon Europe, through in Cluster 5, Climate, Energy and Mobility, are focused on safe and cost-effective CO2 storage, as already mentioned. Our challenge in front of us, and I would say the pathway to make this a success and to achieve our commitments for 2030 and 2050, is that by 2030, first we need large-scale commercial installations, and this can be achieved through a supportive regulatory framework to be developed, and also risk-sharing financial measures both at national and EU level. And as mentioned in the new industrial strategy update released last month, new industrial alliances should take into account CCS and CCU, and in order to set up huge investments required and build viable business models. Next slide. Thank you for your attention, and I've listed some key web links where you can get further information and further reading. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for a very good presentation. Before I see we are running quite on time, but before we move into the panel discussion, I would just ask the moderators if there might be one or two questions coming up from the Q&A that we might want to ask. Use the opportunity.
Hi, thanks for that, Lamberto, and thank you for that very informative policy perspective, Vincent. I think there's a question around whether we can anticipate the Fit for 55 package to, you mentioned DACs and BECs, whether we can expect that to be incentivized, sort of that package to have incentives for DACs and BECs in particular.
Well, actually, Fit for 55 package are in development, and they are based on contributions for the different industrial sectors. And what I can say is that there are several in the industrial sectors which are concerned very, very deeply by CCS and CCU technologies, as you can imagine. And as far as I know, the DACCS and DECCS are things which can be considered through this Fit for 55 package and transition pathway as currently developed.
Thank you for that. And I'm looking at the questions. I think there have been a number of questions about storage. I'm happy to sort of bring that up with our panelists as well. But Vincent, in your view, what do you see as prospects for onshore storage in continental Europe as opposed to offshore storage, if you have any views on that?
Well, I know perfectly well, specifically from my previous industrial activity, that the public acceptance is a big challenge. Mm-hmm. Whatever industrial activities you conduct, specifically when you work in heavy industry, energy-intensive industries, and so on, and gas industry, oil and gas industry, and on top of that, CO2 storage. So public acceptance is a key issue, and we do not give up with the potential of onshore storage. It's important to mention that, and this is why we are absolutely convinced that we need to develop a solid, well explained and well justified regulatory framework for such activities, in order to give some basis for projects against, I would say, potential unjustified public inacceptance. But the challenge is there, and it should be addressed through a different way. And of course, we should absolutely avoid any I would say hazard or problem which could be exploited to bar any further projects due to bad record, something like that. So definitely, we do not give up with onshore storage. We know that it's not an easy task, of course, it's something which should be located for in a very suitable locations, but there are quite a few.
Thanks very much for that, Vincent. And thank you for this again, sort of Lamberto, for your introduction, and to Vincent for this great presentation as well. And may I please now invite our panelists to this. As Lamberto mentioned, my name is Galorin Turan, and I am the General Manager of Advocacy at the Global CCS Institute. The Global CCS Institute is an international think tank, and our mission is to accelerate the deployment of carbon capture and storage as a key technology to tackle climate change and deliver climate neutrality. To speak further about the role of carbon capture and storage in Europe are three industry experts currently deeply involved in CCS efforts. Joining me today are Odin Rasjorde, Director of CCS Technology and Knowledge Hub at Gassnova, the Norwegian state-owned enterprise that's pursuing CCS development. Luca Giansanti, Head of European Government Affairs for ENI, the Global Energy Major. And last but not least, Vianney de Boucher, Vice President of Energy Transition Europe with Air Liquide, again, the Global Industrial Major. So welcome and thank you for joining us today. I will start this session with a few questions of my own to our experts, the panelists, and we'll try to sort of take some questions at the end if we have time. I can already see that questions are being posted through the Q&A function, and if appropriate, I'll try to sort of incorporate them into this as well. But if that's okay, I would like to start by asking each of our panelists to give us a little bit of background about your organizations, and particularly with respect to its strategy and investments when it comes to CCS and what projects you're pursuing currently. And if I may start with Odin.
Thank you. So I'll start with just explaining a bit about Gassnova, which is a state-owned enterprise with the sole purpose of pursuing the Norwegian state strategy on CCS. And we facilitate the development of technology and solutions that can ensure cost-efficient deployment of CCS, and obviously as a tool to reduce climate change. And we also serve as the advisor to the government on this issue. So when the Norwegian government now has decided to invest large sums to help realize the Longship project, the aim is primarily to demonstrate that it is viable to establish a complete CCS chain with capture, transport, and storage. And we believe really that the demonstration aspect is important and will pave way for new projects. And furthermore, we believe also that the establishment of a storage hub with a flexible transport solution is an important step forward, as it reduces the barrier for developing new capture projects. As you may know, it's the Northern Lights joint venture owned by Shell, Total, and Equinor who is responsible for this transport and storage infrastructure. And the agreement between the Norwegian state and Northern Lights will ensure that there is a strong incentive for them to develop CCS further and bring transport and storage service to the market. And I believe that that will create new CCS opportunities across, in particular, Northern Europe. And after working in the field of CCS for more than 15 years, we see that the change now taking place is clearly a step change. Firstly, the EU's legally binding net zero in 2050. With that, more industries see that they need CCS to reach the climate target. And secondly, with the Longship investment, we believe that a significant barrier has been lowered for those who need to reduce the emissions with CCS. And we see an emerging market on the transport and storage side, where it's put forward there as a service. And this opens up for more players to enter CCS. And we also see it through the CLIMIT program that we operate to support development of technologies. There is an increasing number of emission source owners who are looking to cooperate to share infrastructure in clusters. And I believe also that that will open up even more possibilities for industries to decarbonize with CCS. And finally, I would just like to say that to strengthen the momentum, I think it's really key that storage hubs under planning, like Portos, Atos, Acorn, Drax, Irvia, and so on, they have been shown on the map already, that they will be funded and realized. I think that's key to drive it further.
Indeed, and when the green light was given for the Longship project, it was after sort of since the 2000s, it's going to be the sort of the next new project in Europe, and hopefully it's going to be the first of many projects to come. We know, as you saw from the Innovation Fund, lots of applications. Luca, if I can turn to you, ENI investments in Ravenna, Italy, in the UK, and perhaps elsewhere. Can you tell us a little bit about ENI's interest in CCS?
Yes, Turan, thank you for this opportunity. Yeah, as it was said, I mean, we are seeing more and more new projects, CCS projects in Europe. And some of them are already being developed, others are planned. But it's, and typically we see these projects on coastal areas because, as it was said, I mean, offshore storage is the preferred option somehow. But also the applications we are seeing for both the PCIs, the projects of common interest, and the applications under the Connecting Europe facility are a testimony of this new wave, as also Odin was mentioning. CCS as a technology is part of ENI's or ENI's long-term decarbonization strategy, the strategy that will lead our company to carbon neutrality, to net zero by 2050. What we have in our plan is roughly 7 million tons of CO2 be captured by here by 2030, and moving up to 50 million tons CO2 per year to be captured at 2050, so which is an ambitious plan. In order to get there, I mean, we have a number of projects. One is in operation, it's Norway, because ENI is a partner with other companies in the Sleipner CCS project, of course. We have projects in the UK which are planned or in the early development phase. We will take care, ENI will take care of the storage side of the Liverpool Bay project, the one which is called HyNet Northwest in the Liverpool Bay. And also we are partnered with other companies in the Net Zero Teesside projects in the UK. So these are the main ones in Europe, out of Italy. We also have projects outside of Europe, but I will stop here. The Adriatic Blue projects, it's somehow our flagship projects because it is based in Ravenna, so we are in the high Adriatic Sea area, where ENI has been exploiting for decades gas fields offshore, which are now almost depleted, and they do offer a huge potential for CO2 offshore storage. The potential is between 300, 500 million tons of CO2 to be stored there globally. All over. And we have onshore an industrial district based also on ENI's activities and our partners' activities, which is that needs to a new economic life, a new economic perspective, given that its activities have been based up to now mainly on those gas fields. And we do have in northern Italy a huge number of CO2 emitters, of course. And as the carbon price is moving up, it's increasing, they see more and more need to capture their CO2, to transport it, and to store it. So this is the main idea around the Adriatic Blue project, which is a big one, and it's supposed to be also a very important hub for CO2 storage in Southern Europe.
Indeed, thanks very much. And sort of shifting sort of European geography a little bit, if I can turn to VNA and talking about hubs and ports. Of course, Air Liquide is involved in a number of the projects in sort of further Northern Europe. Can you please tell us a little bit about how CCS fits in with Air Liquide and what some of your kind of activities in this space are?
Yes, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity. I will talk a bit on North Europe, but I will also talk a bit on South Europe. I think we very much welcome the initiative of Eni, Luca as well. Of course, short-term, super short-term priority is North Europe, but given the ambitions that industry has to decarbonize, to see the emergence of something happening as well in the south is very much welcomed by Air Liquide, but more globally by the industry. So I can really confirm that. As part of Air Liquide strategy, the group has announced its new ambitions for energy transition. That was last March, announced to the investor community, with ambition to reduce by 1/3 by 2035 already in absolute terms the emissions. And there are different pathways to get there, and those targets apply both to Scope 1 and Scope 2. There are different pathways to get there, in particular for Scope 1. As you can imagine, for Air Liquide, Scope 1 is relatively important in terms of hydrogen production. CCS is certainly a very essential pathway. It's not the only one, we have to be fair as well. But as a complement, as one of the pillars, in addition to green hydrogen, to renewable sourcing, to continued effort on efficiency, we are convinced that there is not only one solution fits all, but without CCS, that's certainly going to be extremely difficult. So CCS is essential short term, and the group is working on a number of CCS projects to first reduce its own emissions in Europe, in Rotterdam, in Antwerp, in other clusters as well. Yeah, several speakers or panelists have mentioned that the role of clusters or the role of coastal, and that's quite that fits very well with our own analysis and our own strategy to start with major plants that are coastal and in clusters, in order to leverage economies of scales, to build industrial alliance, has been very rightly said by Vincent. And those flagship that combine cluster, coastal, and industrial alliance, we think are really the priorities to kickstart CCS and cross-border CCS in Europe. So yeah, CCS at the heart of the strategy, in complement with other pathways. I will not elaborate on the challenges that are still ahead of us. Priority is to get first project cross-border very short term. If we can get them online in 2025, that's really the objective. So there's still a lot of work to be done to reach there, but the will is there, and with collaboration of various actors, we think that's doable.
Thank you. Thank you. Indeed, the challenge is there, but we have to. The targets are there too, and I'll come back to that timeline question in a few moments. But Vianney mentioned, I mean, and we've heard about clusters. So perhaps something that I'm just going to ask to all the panelists in terms of, I don't know who would like to answer, but some questions around transport and storage. We mentioned clusters, particularly cross-country, cross-boundary transport and storage of CO2. What's your perspective? What's the perspective on the current state of CO2 storage and transport, and what can be done to further support the development of transport and storage infrastructure in Europe?
Okay.
Luca?
Yeah, if I may, Fran, we need probably to start from a fact that was mentioned already before. The fact that, I mean, emission sites are widely distributed in Europe, while storage sites are located in some locations, which means that you need to connect them. So transport and cross-border transport is really of the essence. This means that in order to develop the CCS as a technology, you need to cover all transport modes. You cannot just look at the pipelines mode. You need to look at ships, barges, train, trucks. So transport is crucial in order to support the development of CCS. At the same time, transport by pipeline, as covered by the EU ETS system, or as mentioned in the 10E regulation, makes sense from an economic point of view only when you are dealing with really high volumes of CO2 to be transported. So really, we need a broader policy framework at EU level for transport, going beyond the pipeline and looking at all transport modes. The same apply to the storage, but I will leave my colleagues to dwell on that. So we need a more comprehensive policy framework and also certainty from a regulatory point of view.
Indeed, thank you, and completely agree. As the Institute, we think that there's more that needs to be done in order to ensure, given the sort of locations of emissions and storage facilities, there needs to be more. BNA?
Yes, I can only subscribe to what Luca has said, so we are in particular at the time being working on a very large project to decarbonize the port of Antwerp by phases. And here, two options are possible: to connect by pipeline to Rotterdam, but we recognize that may take some time. Cross-border pipeline are not so easy. You can justify them when you have really a very large volume. So on the mid-term to long term, that's certainly a pathway. On the short term, what do we do? So to indeed to imagine on the long term, multimodal export is certainly the way forwards to combine and to mitigate risks. That would certainly be the way forward for large clusters, and in that context, that would be very much welcome to see an alignment of policy and subsidies on the shipping or on the pipeline, because in the end, for industrial emitters, we are a little bit neutral in terms of technology. Or in terms of way of transporting, because of legacy, of course, of the past, which we all understand, it's not yet the case. That's a point of attention. Yeah.
No, but obviously having the different options and flexibility, shipping, barges, pipeline, etc., is really important, isn't it, for particular industrial emitters, etc., and for these hubs and clusters to be able to have that sort of flexibility. So, can I turn to Odin? And Odin, we've been having a few sort of questions. In fact, I asked one of them to Vincent, but about storage, CO2 storage, and undoubtedly, particularly in Europe, the question of safety always comes up. You know, we put CO2, does it stay there? Is there any sort of risk of leakage? And also, what's your view on, Europe's potential for storage onshore versus offshore, if you would like to kind of make any observations on that?
Yeah. I just have then to make a disclaimer that I'm certainly not an expert on the, let's say, geological side of the storage, but from what I gather, it's safe storage there are several things that applies, and I think the EU regulations, the CCS directive, and also the national legislation around focus a lot on how to make it safe. And also how to monitor to make sure it stays in place and make you be able to do mitigating actions if it is moving. And there is, of course, having it offshore, it helps at least on the public perception. You move it along away from people, but I think you could have the same safety also onshore. And there's a lot of material available for those interested, and there are certain facts that the CO2 will, as the longer it stays in the ground, the more safe it becomes, because it is going towards a mineralization state, and it dissolves in water and so on. But these processes, I think, also rely a bit on what kind of storage are you talking about. So, and from what I understand, the volumes or the potential to store CO2 beneath the Northern Sea, North Sea is huge. So I have the impression that that is really the dominating the capacity in Europe. Although I saw on the map that was shown earlier here today that there are also a lot of volumes in Romania, and I guess also other places. So, but I think safe storage is, at least from a Norwegian perspective, that's not a worry, and we believe it can be handled, and that it has been shown for many years to be safe.
Indeed, it's been operating since the 1990s, isn't it? So it's been sort of, we saw some more than 20 years. So I think it's a great example of how it can be done, how it can, and it is being done sort of safely, securely, etc. I'd like to come back to the point about the climate neutrality and European ambition and targets and the timeline. How do you see this timeline impacting actors, decisions, the sense of urgency, and perhaps also what more do you think can be done by the policymakers or for industrial players or various different actors in terms of this sort of 2030 and then 2050 timelines?
But Vincent was mentioning it before. I mean, the Commission acknowledges, I mean, the role of CCS in order to meet these new climate ambitions and this new very ambitious target for 2030 and 2050. I mean, we all know that CCS alone is not a silver bullet, but it has a major role to play in order to get there. The problem I see and the challenge I see is that, I mean, the policy framework is not completed, it's fragmented. And it dates back to the CCS directive of 2009, which was addressing safety mainly, which is very relevant. And I fully subscribe to what Odin was saying before. But still, there is a lot more to be covered. And honestly, we cannot wait for 2030 in order to get a more comprehensive and integrated policy framework to support the technology. There is an urgency. And the policy and legislative side has to match a little bit this flourishing of projects that we are seeing in Europe. What we need is a policy framework that would cover the full value chain, capture, transport, storage, and gives the industry and all the players certainty from legal and regulatory point of view.
Predictability and certainty. One of the things, again, Vincent was discussing in his presentation was the issue of social-public acceptance. And one of the things which we didn't mention, but perhaps maybe Odin could speak to, is CCS can also, I personally believe, can help with managing the socio-economic impacts of energy transition, particularly as we're going into, as we're decarbonizing. And we've discussed, for example, how it can provide employment opportunities in Norway. Maybe if you could say a few words about that, Odin.
Yeah, of course, I think that's obviously a part of the equation to generate activity. We see that, for instance, with the Longship project, it's generating some jobs and so on, but the storage and transport part is, once it's built, I would say it's not a lot of people that's going to work on that because it's quite efficient and you can handle big volumes. But also on the capture side, I think the goal must be to kind of capture the CO2 without too much manpower extra. So, but on the kind of course technology side, those kind of end up developing the winning technologies. I guess there is a lot of opportunities there. And of course, kind of license to operate for many industries, that you make your job safe for the future. Exactly. I think that's also an important point.
I'm in the UK where I'm based. That's seen as one of the big drivers of hub and cluster models, the government support for industrial decarbonization, ensuring that these industries stay within Europe, stay within the UK, etc., as opposed to steel, cement, etc., etc. So that sort of comes with actually that license to operate. I think we just have with 1 minute to go. I would like to thank all our speakers, our panelists, very, very much for being with us today. And on behalf of the Global CCS Institute and the Zero Emissions Platform, I'd like to thank our audience as well. If you would like to learn more about the global status of CCS, please head to the Institute's website, globalccs.com, for our global status of CCS report, which is free to download. And if you would like to learn more about the Zero Emissions Platform's work, please head to the Zero Emissions Platform.eu. And thanks again for joining us today. And I hope you all have a great day. Thank you.